In order to evaluate our dual process theory of ethical cognition and to draw some conclusions about its significance for ethics or not, we need to be clear about the auxiliary hypotheses that we're relying on. Now, quite a bit of the literature that you might read, particularly by the philosophers, is not super clear about auxiliary hypotheses, and sometimes it appears as if the dual process theory is being rejected on the grounds of what really are optional auxiliary hypotheses. So let's look carefully at these. Let's take a look at these. So if you remember, this is my loose reconstruction of Green's argument. Loose reconstruction, it's not supposed to be a true account of what Green is actually saying. It's supposed to get at the core of the argument, maximising the chances of getting an interesting conclusion from premises which are true. Now, the first premise is that ethical judgments are explained by a dual process theory, which distinguishes faster from slower processes. And if you were paying attention before, you'll know that my dual process theory is this very stripped down light thing, which just involves this claim. Two or more ethical processes are distinct in this sense. The conditions that influence whether or not those processes occur and which outputs they generate don't completely overlap. So, for example, time pressure may have a stronger effect on one process and a less strong effect on another. Time pressure matters for both, but much more to one than another. We can add to that, and we do need to add to that, the idea that one of these processes makes fewer demands on scarce cognitive resources than the other. So, for example, if it comes to working memory, the idea will be one of these processes places higher demands on working memory, the other places lower demands on working memory. And that allows us to talk very loosely about fast and slow. So a fast process is one that places lower demands on working memory than a slow process. Slow process tends to be more demanding of this. And also things like attention. You have limited attentional capacity. So if a process places demands, high demands on your attentional capacities, that's a slow process as opposed to a fast one, which places little or no demands on attention. So that's the core of the stripped down dual process theory. Why do we need any auxiliary hypotheses at all? That's kind of an artifact, actually. That's an artifact of the way that things are done in this research. So we wouldn't, strictly speaking, need auxiliary hypotheses at this stage if we had experiments which measure simultaneously multiple responses. So if they, for example, measured eye gaze as well as explicit verbal judgments, or looked at dissociations between response times and what the response is, or movement onset times and what the response is. So in other domains, we are in a fortunate situation where we don't need auxiliary hypotheses. The problem is that in the moral psychology domain, nearly all of the evidence that's currently available involves observations of a single response, which unfortunately is usually a response to a vignette, a rating of how morally good or bad somebody is, for example. So that, of course, constrains kind of predictions we can make. Now, here's the thing. Suppose you want to vary cognitive load. What sort of predictions can you make? Well, if we go with the stripped down dual process theory, by itself, it doesn't allow us to make readily testable predictions about how cognitive load is going to affect the response. So the response is the thing that we observe. Cognitive load is the thing that we manipulate. Here are our theoretical constructs, the two processes in the middle. What we need are some predictions which are generated by the dual process theory and not by any of its competitors about what happens when cognitive load is manipulated. And as long as we've got one response here with no sort of background reason to connect that to one or the other process, we're in trouble. And that's why we need the auxiliary hypotheses. They're going to get us the predictions. Now, by comparison, we had some auxiliary hypotheses in the case of physical cognition. So exactly the same stripped down core dual process theory, together with an auxiliary hypothesis, which is that the faster processes tended to rely on impetus mechanics when things were going well. So to make the responses they would generate would be responses that would be correct if impetus mechanics were a true theory about the nature of the physical. Whereas the slower processes, not always, but in the case of the trained physicists, would deliver characteristically Newtonian, or perhaps even more sophisticated responses. That's to say, responses that would be correct if the world were as Newton thought it was. So that was the idea. We've got an auxiliary hypothesis here about the difference in the types of physical assumptions that underpin the outputs of the faster and the slower processes. And that allows us to generate lots of predictions. Very good. Now, here's what we've got in the ethical case. It's a little bit less clear. Green says here's what he calls the central tension principle. Now, I'm not sure why it's called a principle. I think it's a hypothesis, an auxiliary hypothesis. He says, characteristically deontological judgments are preferentially supported by automatic emotional responses, while characteristically consequentialist judgments are preferentially supported by conscious reasoning and allied processes of cognitive control. Now, we need to do a bit of tidying up here. So if you were writing this, I'd be saying to you, you could put this a bit more clearly. One thing is this: we've got a contrast between responses and processes. Now, if you're talking about responses in one case and processes in another, I would expect that you're using that difference to mark an actual substantive difference. But in this case, I don't think there is. So what we're going to do is give Green the benefit of the doubt here and just remove that word and replace it with the word processes. It's not what he says, but I think he's messing around without actually making a distinction here. Brilliant though he is. Now, what are these deontological judgments? Well, as in the case of the physical cognition, what we mean is this: judgments that would be the consequence of a plausible deontological theory. If the ethical aspects of the world were as deontologists think they are, then these judgments would be correct. Those are characteristically deontological judgments. Same thing for our characteristically consequentialist judgments. So there's no commitment at all at this point to saying, look, gosh, that slow process is really, working. It's people who've read Mill or something like that. What Green seems to be saying here is that these are the kind of judgments that would be correct if a plausible consequentialist theory were true. That's the idea. Now, what have we got here? So here we've got automatic. That's a bit tricky, but I think that we can deal with that in terms of our stripped down dual process theory by thinking of automatic just as referring in a very loose way in this context to meaning it's not placing higher demands on scarce cognitive resources like working memory. Right? It's not a very principled idea, but it'll get her through it. The appeal to the emotional here, I'm not sure we need that at all. The contrast with conscious reasoning, I think we've got no need for that. That's doing no work in generating predictions in Green's writing. This is kind of decorative. So what we really want here, I think, are fast and slow. We want to stick to the point here and not get caught up in a bunch of extraneous stuff about automaticity or conscious reasoning. Very complicated, difficult topics to grapple with. Let's not go there unless there's some clear benefit in the predictions that we can generate from doing so. Maybe there is, but the evidence that we've got today doesn't point us in that direction. So let's not worry about those things. All right. Now, so what we've got, if we strip all of that extraneous matter away, what we've got is an association between the faster process and the deontology, the slower process and the consequentialism. But what is that kind of link? Now here, Green says preferentially supported, and I find that kind of difficult to work out what's going on here. But there's another place in this paper where Green says this, makes a surprisingly strong claim. Unless you're prepared to say yes to the footbridge case, your automatic settings are still running the show. Right. So this is, if you remember, the case where there's somebody on the footbridge, and if you get the person off the footbridge, then the trolley will crash into that person, killing her, but saving 5 people down the track from certain death. So you've killed 1 person in order to save 5. And Green says, unless you're prepared to say yes to the footbridge case, your automatic settings are still running the show. So I interpret this is my first interpretation, as saying, if you've got a response which is not consequentialist, then it's a consequence of the fast process. And that helps me to understand what preferentially means. I think what Green is saying here is that the fast process, my term for it, not his, the fast process is never consequentialist. Sorry, no, that's wrong. The slow process is never not consequentialist. And I can't see how you get this unless you accept that. That's why it's my interpretation. At the same time, this is clearly false. As many people have pointed out, it's perfectly possible to use your slow processes to reason very carefully and produce deontological judgments, right? So Cam, for example, is a good case of that. Whether or not you agree with Cam, it's not that I agree with her, and you don't have to either. I don't think that when she's writing a book, the book is the output of the fast process. I think that's the output predominantly. I mean, both processes are involved in any response, but writing a book is one response that's predominantly a consequence of Cam's slow processes. So this is clearly an incorrect claim. So it can't really be how green means preferentially, and that can't be what he means here as well. So I'm a bit puzzled. Here's what I'm going to do. When I'm a bit puzzled, there's also this thing actually, this running the show as well. Gosh, I'm not really sure what that is. It's all very elusive to me. I just really have trouble pinning this down. So when I have trouble pinning things down like this, I think the right thing to do here is not to worry too much about what Green says. So Green's very brilliant in his own way. And when Green says things that are clear and that we understand and are well supported, we can accept them. And otherwise, we can just go our own way. We can use the materials that he's provided and formulate things as clearly and carefully as we can. Now, let's see what would happen in the physical case. So go back to physical cognition once more. We've got a connection between impetus mechanics and Newtonian mechanics. Faster processes, impetus-like, slower processes, Newtonian-esque. But what would we say here? What we want to say here, I think, if we're being careful, is that the slower processes are sometimes characteristically Newtonian. That's in people who've been trained in A-level physics, I guess. So the kind of physics that you study until you're about 18. Now, someone who's been to university might have quite a different theory of the physical, or if they've studied Hegel, they might have, an entirely different theory of the physical. Alternatively, somebody who's never studied physics might actually, when they're thinking slowly, be essentially an impetus mechanics person. They might have bought into that. By contrast, the claim is that the faster processes are always going to give you responses that are characteristic of impetus mechanics, except in the case where things go wrong and there are errors, essentially where the process breaks down or doesn't produce a result. So if we're being careful here, this is what we'd say. And you can see that we could say something parallel about consequentialism and deontology. But let's go even slower. So let's have a table of candidates for auxiliary hypotheses. So one hypothesis we could make is that the slow process is sometimes consequentialist, whereas the fast process is always deontological. What's important here is that we can actually split this into two independent claims. So to get this, we could say the slow one is sometimes consequentialist. The fast one is never consequentialist. So that's one hypothesis, one row of my table, one hypothesis. Separate, independent hypothesis says the fast process is always deontological. The slow process is sometimes not deontological. Now those two hypotheses are close enough that you might think, I don't really care which is right, but they are distinct. They are indeed distinct hypotheses. They are indeed distinct hypotheses, and we shouldn't necessarily assume both of them if we can get away with just assuming one. The goal here in constructing a dual process theory is to make the fewest possible assumptions that give us the greatest predictive power, the greatest power of being refuted. It's not helpful to us if we add assumptions into our picture that we can't actually generate predictions from that give us the potential for being refuted. In that case, all we're doing is just making what I think of as a parlay bet. So a parlay bet is a bet on the outcomes of multiple different races. So you bet on Tea Time to win the first race and Buttercup to win the second race, and then you bet on my favourite horse, Star of David, to win the third race. This is very exciting because after two races, if your horses have come in first, everything's hanging on the third race. And because the odds on the parlay bet are very, very small, very, very small odds, of course, now you stand to make an enormous win. So it's very exciting. There's nothing wrong with a parlay bet. When the odds are in your favour, it can be a very good way to go, right? But a parlay bet is something different from a theory. A parlay bet is something different from a theory. When you're doing theory construction, you do not want to chuck in loads of different assumptions, the odds of them all being true fairly small, but you can't really kind of test them. What you want is the smallest stripped down theory that you can that generates maximum predictions to give yourself a good chance of being refuted without lots of extra claims, consciousness, reasoning, chuck it all in. Why do that? Why do that? It's not helping you. All right. Now, there is a further candidate auxiliary hypothesis that we might consider. So Fiery Cushman, who actually worked in collaboration with Green for much of his career, offers us a related but distinct possibility. We could suppose that the fast process always operates only over representations of act types, so things like the pushing, kicking, killing and the rest, so actions described in terms of relatively proximal outcomes, their characteristic outcomes, the punching, the kicking, the pushing and so on. Whereas the slow process operates, we might think, in terms, at least sometimes, in terms of more distal outcomes. So if you imagine the footbridge case, killing the one person is a relatively proximal outcome. That comes earlier in the chains of means and ends. Saving 5 people is a relatively distal outcome. That comes later in the chain of means and ends. So what Cushman might be suggesting here is that the faster you are, the less likely you are to consider outcomes which are further related by means further away in terms of the means-end relation compared to the nearer ones. You're more likely to represent the action as pushing or killing, which is clearly wrong, than the action of saving 5, which is obviously a good thing. Now you can see I've put these diagonally because once again we can separate 2 hypotheses here. It's a minor detail. So we might say the fast process always considers only act types, so proximal outcomes, pushing and so on, whereas the slower process sometimes considers things which are not mere act types. So that might give us rule utilitarianism. Or we might go the other way around. We might say the slow process will sometimes consider relatively distal outcomes, but the fast process will never do that. So we've got here 2 separate hypotheses, which Cushman describes one hypothesis by talking about fast is related to actions in his terminology, slow is related to outcomes. My suggestion is we separate out those 2 hypotheses, just like we did with Green. All right, very good. Now Cushman, in the same 2013 very interesting theoretical paper that he's written there, he offers us also the possibility that we could think of the fast process as based on model-free representations. So loosely speaking, these are representations which are not consequences of a causal model of the world that's carried around in the mind. So there is no mental causal model of the world in a model-free process, whereas the slow processes might be model-based. That's to say that the slow process might be based on a causal model of the world. And actually that's very closely related. So as he points out there, these are 2 distinct ideas, but they're extremely closely related. And in particular, if you thought that the model-free, model-based distinction was right, then you'd have a good reason to think that the fast process would have an extremely limited capacity to deal with outcomes of actions which are further down the means end chain. So those 2 hypotheses are linked. And then finally, there is also the hypothesis that the fast process is an effective process and the slow process is a cognitive process. And indeed, in the last quote from Green that we have just seen in this section, Green characterises the processes like that, just in passing: fast effective, slow cognitive. Now just here I think we should definitely balk at this. There may be something to this, but it's clear that in some sense, when you're reasoning, a lot of the time you are, perhaps quite rightly, guided by things that you feel. A lot of the time you might be, in reasoning, guided by things that you feel. It's wrong to make somebody angry, it's good to make them happy and so on. So it just seems to me, yes, there might be ways to tidy this up, but this is going to need an awful lot of tidying up before it's going to make any sense. So the first thing I want to do is get rid of this effective cognitive distinction. So that isn't particularly helpful for us, I think. And now we've got still in play here 5 candidate auxiliary hypotheses. Given that we want our dual process theory to generate maximal predictions, greatest chance of being false, on the basis of fewest assumptions, I don't think we should accept all of them. I think actually we should aim to accept just one of these assumptions. And it's quite difficult to pick one, but I've thought about this, and my personal choice here, thinking about the evidence, is this. We're going to suppose that the fast process never computes distal outcomes, but the slow process sometimes does so. I'll refine that slightly for you in a second. So my suggestion here is that this is a good one to pick as an auxiliary assumption because it is the weakest one. So for example, it's actually entailed by the first one here, I think, or almost entailed by the first one. That's not quite right. So you can't be consequentialist without sometimes reflecting on outcomes. So it's partly entailed by the first one, isn't it? So I think it's in some sense, in the interesting sense, is it's weaker than some of the other ones, but it also allows us to generate all of the testable predictions that we need to make use of existing evidence. So I think our first auxiliary hypothesis should be this one, but perhaps there are others that we might eventually need later. We shouldn't introduce those till we need them. So here's my dual process theory with the one auxiliary hypothesis. The hypothesis that only the slow process ever flexibly and rapidly takes into account differences in the outcomes of an action. Only the slow process ever flexibly and rapidly takes into account differences in the outcomes of an action. So if we want to test whether or not a response is due to the fast process or the slow process, what we might do is to see what happens when we change the outcomes of an action in ways that are not likely, it's not likely that could have been sort of learned through lots of trial and error. If we have these rapid and perhaps unexpected changes in the outcome that an action generates, and we find that that immediately makes a difference to the response, we should lean towards the idea that the response is dominated by the slow process. Where that's not the case, we might lean in the other way and think it's a consequence of the fast process, although you'll see that things get even more complicated there. So we're putting the whole thing together now. Here's our dual process theory of ethical abilities. This is the stripped down part of it. We're just assuming that there are two processes where one is fast and the other slow, and this is the one auxiliary hypothesis that we need. Why have I been concerned to take you through what surely seems like a rather dry piece of the research? I think it's important for evaluating the evidence for and against the dual process theory. In particular, it saves us from some not strictly speaking relevant objections to the dual process theory. I also think it's important for understanding the significance of the dual process theory as well, for evaluating whether or not the dual process theory might allow us to establish, for example, that consequentialism is true.